The roses were blooming again. Every June, without fail, no matter what the winter had done to the world, Robert's roses came back, pink and full and stubborn, climbing the white fence along the east side of my yard like they had somewhere important to be. I used to tease him about those roses. "Robert Holloway, you spend more time with those flowers than you do with me." He'd laugh that low, quiet laugh of his and say, "Dorothy May, these roses need more patience than you do." He wasn't wrong. I was standing in the garden on a Saturday morning in early May, coffee in hand, watching a fat bumblebee investigate the newest blooms when I let myself feel it. That particular kind of peace that only comes when you're exactly where you belong. Number 312 Maple Drive. The two-story colonial with the green shutters and the creaky third porch step that Robert kept promising to fix and never did. We'd bought this house in 1986 for $142,000, which felt like an impossible sum at the time. We'd paid off the last of the mortgage in 2003, and Robert had opened a bottle of champagne he'd been saving since our wedding. We sat on this very porch and drank it warm because we'd forgotten to chill it, and it was the best thing I'd ever tasted. Robert had been gone 6 years now. Pancreatic cancer. Fast and brutal and deeply unfair for a man who'd never smoked a day in his life, who walked 2 miles every morning, who ate his vegetables without complaint. 51 days from diagnosis to the end. I had held his hand through every one of those days, and when he was gone I had sat in this garden for a long time, just listening to the silence where he used to be. But I was still here, 74 years old, still here, still standing. People sometimes looked at me with that particular soft-eyed concern that meant they expected me to be fragile, and I understood it. I did. A widow, living alone in a 4-bedroom house at my age. From the outside, I suppose it looked like a problem waiting to happen. From the inside, it felt like my life. Full, purposeful, entirely my own. Monday and Wednesday mornings, I volunteered at the Glenwood Public Library, helping with the children's reading program, and lately, teaching basic computer skills to other seniors who wanted to learn but didn't know where to start. Thursdays were bridge club, rotating between our homes, and when it was my turn, I made my grandmother's lemon pound cake and set out the good china without a second thought. Fridays I went to yoga at the Glenwood Community Center, a gentle class designed for women my age, led by a 26-year-old named Kayla, who called us all ladies and meant it as the highest compliment. On weekends I gardened, I cooked, I read. I called my friend Ruth Abernathy every Sunday evening, and we talked for an hour about books and local gossip and the state of the world. I drove myself everywhere. I managed my own finances, $47,000 in savings, a modest pension from my 30 years as a registered nurse, Social Security, and the house itself, which a neighbor had casually mentioned was worth somewhere around $820,000 in the current market. That number still startled me sometimes. Robert and I had bought it for less than a fifth of that. We had worked ourselves to the bone for this house, and it had rewarded us by simply existing, simply standing, simply being ours. I was not a woman who needed rescuing. I want you to understand that before I go any further, because what I'm about to tell you might make you wonder if I was somehow naive or confused or not paying attention. The truth is, I was paying close attention. I just didn't want to see what I was seeing. My son Brandon was 46 years old, a financial advisor at Merritt & Cole Wealth Management in downtown Glenwood. He was good-looking in the way Robert had been good-looking. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark eyes that could be warm when he wanted them to be. He had married Crystal 8 years ago, a 42-year-old woman with expensive highlights and a smile that arrived slightly before her eyes did. They had no children. They had a very nice house in the Ashford Hills subdivision, 2 late-model cars, and memberships to the kind of gym where people wear matching workout sets. They vacationed in places I'd only seen in magazines. Brandon called every Sunday. He visited twice a month, sometimes more. He told me he loved me, and I believed him, because he was my son, and because I am, at my core, a woman who wants to believe the people she loves. That was the first crack in my armor, if I'm being honest. Not naivety, not confusion. Just love doing what love does, making you want to see the best in someone even when something small and quiet at the back of your mind is whispering that the best might not be all that's there. It started gradually. That's always how it starts, I think. Not with a dramatic confrontation, but with small things that you file away and almost forget. 6 months before everything changed, Brandon began visiting more often. Not twice a month anymore, 3 times a week, then 4. He'd arrive with Crystal, and they'd sit in my kitchen drinking the coffee I made them, and I was glad to have the company, genuinely glad. But there was something different about the visits, a quality of attention that felt less like warmth and more like assessment. Brandon would walk through the rooms with his hands in his pockets, his eyes moving slowly across the walls, the floors, the ceilings. "Mom, this carpet is worn down something awful." He'd say it like a doctor noting a symptom. "Mom, those stairs. I worry about you going up and down those stairs every day." Crystal would nod at everything he said, her painted nails wrapped around her coffee mug, her eyes drifting to the antique sideboard in the dining room, to the original artwork Robert and I had collected over the years, to the built-in bookshelves Robert had built by hand and filled with 40 years of our reading life. "This house is just so much space for one person," Crystal said once, in a voice that was almost musical, almost kind. "Don't you ever feel overwhelmed, Dorothy?" "No," I said pleasantly. "I feel at home." She smiled. The smile arrived before her eyes did, as always. They began bringing things up. Assisted living facilities. Not as suggestions exactly, more like topics of intellectual interest. "Brandon and I were reading about this wonderful place called Sunrise Valley, Mom. They have a pool and a garden and activities every day." "Of course you'd never want that," Crystal would add quickly. "But it's just nice to know these things exist, isn't it?" I told them, clearly and more than once, that I had no interest in leaving my home, that I was managing perfectly well, that I had a full life and a good doctor and a community I loved. They listened with patient expressions and then returned to the subject 3 visits later as though I hadn't spoken. I was irritated. I was not yet afraid. The fear came the day they brought Gerald Foss. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, a slight man in a gray suit who shook my hand with both of his and introduced himself as an independent elder care consultant. He had brochures. He had a briefcase. He had the practiced warmth of a man who did this for a living. "I just want to learn a little about your situation, Mrs. Holloway," he said, settling into my living room like he'd been invited. "Brandon and Crystal are so devoted to your well-being. They just want to make sure you have the best possible support as your needs evolve." I did not like Gerald Foss. I answered his questions briefly and showed them all out before noon. That evening I called Ruth and told her about it, and Ruth said what Ruth always says when something bothers her. "Dorothy May, your gut is never wrong. What's your gut saying?" "That something is happening," I said, he said. "And I don't fully understand what it is yet." What I did not know, what I would not learn until much later, was that Gerald Foss was not an independent consultant at all. He was a contract employee of Summit Real Estate Partners, the brokerage firm that would stand to earn a commission of over $40,000 when my house sold. There was nothing independent about him. He was a piece of a plan, and I was the last one to know it. It was the first Tuesday of October, and the morning light was doing that particular autumn thing it does in New England, coming in low and golden through the kitchen windows, making everything look warmer than it was. I was finishing my second cup of coffee when I heard Brandon's car in the driveway. I hadn't expected him. I went to the door and found Brandon and Crystal on my porch, and behind them, Gerald Foss again, and a woman I didn't recognize carrying a leather portfolio. They came in without being fully invited. That was the first wrong note. Brandon asked me to sit down at my kitchen table, the same table where I had fed him breakfast for 18 years, where I had helped him with algebra homework and college applications, and once, at 2 in the morning when he was 23, talked him through a heartbreak over a girl whose name I've long since forgotten. That table was the center of everything good that had happened in this kitchen, and he used it that morning to dismantle me. "Mom," his voice was careful, the way you're careful with something fragile. "We need to have a serious conversation about your future." I wasn't aware my future was in question, I said. "We found a place for you, Sunrise Valley Retirement Community. It's the best in the state. Top-rated, beautiful grounds, and they have immediate availability." "Brandon," I said very calmly, "I am not going to Sunrise Valley." Crystal's voice came from slightly behind him. "You don't really have a choice, Dorothy." Brandon shot her a look. "What Crystal means," he said, smoothing his voice back out, "is that we've already been in contact with them. We've looked at the financial picture. We sell the house, the proceeds cover your care indefinitely, and you'll be safe and comfortable and looked after. Isn't that what matters, Mom? Being safe? Gerald Foss opened his briefcase. The woman with the portfolio laid documents across my kitchen table, pages and pages, printed small, full of language I couldn't follow in the speed of the moment. Foss began explaining. Power of attorney, deed transfer, care agreements, something about facilitating the transition. His voice was low and even and relentless. Brandon put a pen in my hand. I looked at my son. I looked at his face, the face I had watched come into the world, had watched learn to smile, had watched grow into a man I was proud of, or thought I was proud of. The face that was now looking at me with impatience, badly disguised as concern. And God help me, some part of me still wanted to believe he loved me. Some part of me that was 60 years of motherhood and loyalty and choosing to see the best. That part picked up the pen and touched it to the paper. I signed, one line after another. Dorothy May Holloway, Dorothy May Holloway, Dorothy May Holloway, giving away everything Robert and I had built. When it was done, Brandon exhaled. Actually exhaled, like he'd been holding his breath. He hugged Crystal. He kissed my forehead the way you kiss a child who has finally stopped crying. Thank you, Mom. You won't regret this, I promise. They were talking about renovation ideas before they reached the front door. I sat alone at my kitchen table and listened to their voices fade down the porch steps, and the quiet that followed was unlike any quiet I had known since the night Robert died. Then I noticed it. A single sheet of paper, left behind on the corner of the table. In the rush of their relief, in their celebration, someone had forgotten it. It was a property valuation document. Letterhead from Summit Real Estate Partners. The estimated market value of 312 Maple Drive, $820,000. And below that, in Brandon's handwriting, I knew his handwriting as well as my own, a column of numbers. Sunrise Valley fees, estimated. Attorney fees. Moving costs. And then, circled twice. Net remaining, $614,000. I sat with that piece of paper for a long time. The bumblebee was probably still in the garden. Robert's roses were probably still blooming. The third porch step was probably still creaking every time someone walked across it. And I had just signed away the right to any of it. For several minutes I felt nothing, just a white, still blankness that I recognized from nursing, from years of receiving terrible news and needing to stay functional. Then, slowly, like a tide coming in, the feeling arrived. Not grief, not fear, anger. Robert and I had worked for 38 years for this house. We had chosen this house over vacations, over newer cars, over luxuries we could have justified. We had paid every mortgage payment on time through recessions and illness and the kind of lean years that test a marriage and a family. We had raised a son here, educated him, loved him, helped him build the very comfortable life he was now trying to fund with the proceeds of ours. I set the paper down very carefully. No, I said, to the empty kitchen, to Robert's ghost in the garden, to the version of myself that had picked up that pen. No, I am not going quietly. They came back the next morning at 8 o'clock. Brandon and Crystal moved through my house with the efficiency of people who had already decided it wasn't mine anymore. Brandon photographed every room. Crystal moved through my belongings with a kind of brisk authority that made my chest tighten. She'd open a cabinet, assess, and decide its fate with the speed of someone who'd done this before, or at least imagined doing it many times. You won't need most of this at Sunrise Valley, she said, lifting my grandmother's china from the sideboard. They have their own dishes. We'll put this in the estate sale. I watched her hands on my grandmother's china and said nothing. This is perhaps the hardest part to explain, why I stayed silent for those 3 days instead of fighting immediately. The honest answer is that I didn't know yet what I was fighting. I didn't know exactly what I'd signed. I didn't know how much was already gone or how quickly things were moving. And there's something about being in your own home while it's being dismantled around you that produces a particular kind of paralysis, like being a guest somewhere that used to belong to you. But at night, after they left, I thought, I have always been a thinker. 30 years of nursing will do that to you. You learn to work problems systematically, to separate emotion from information, to ask what do I actually know before you ask what do I feel. So at night I sat at my kitchen table with cold tea, and I worked the problem. What did I know? I'd signed documents I didn't fully understand. I had not had independent legal representation. The sale of my house was planned for next week. My son had prepared this with considerable planning and apparent premeditation. That number, circled twice in his handwriting, told me the thinking behind this was not new. What didn't I know? What exactly the document said? What, if anything, had already changed in my financial accounts? Whether any of it could be undone? What did I need? Information, counsel, someone in my corner. By Thursday night, I was ready to move. I thought about what Brandon had said. What if something happens and no one's here? And I realized the cruelest irony. The only person threatening my safety and independence was him. I thought about Robert. I thought about what he would say if he could see this kitchen right now, his wife sitting here while their sons sorted their life into boxes for an estate sale. Robert was a quiet man, but he was not a passive one. He would have looked at me with those dark eyes and said very simply, "Dorothy May, get up." I got up. I was 74 years old. I had survived the deaths of my parents, 30 years of night shifts and impossible diagnoses, Robert's illness, Robert's absence. I had kept this house and this life intact through everything the world had seen fit to throw at me. I was not about to let my son sell it out from under me without a fight. The next morning, I called a taxi. And that, dear listeners, is where part 1 ends, with a woman sitting at her own kitchen table, finally ready to fight back. Stay with me, because what comes next changes everything. The taxi driver was a young man named Eddie who tried to make conversation about the weather. I answered him in monosyllables, not out of rudeness, but because I was using every spare piece of my mind to rehearse what I needed to say and to whom. The Glenwood Public Library opened at 9. I was on the front steps at 8:55. Ruth Abernathy was already inside, shelving returns in the large print fiction section, the way she did every Friday morning. She was 71, small and sharp-eyed. With silver hair she kept cropped close and a way of looking at you that made you feel she could see straight through to your back teeth. We had been friends for 25 years, since our children were in the same elementary school, since we'd been assigned to the same committee for the spring fundraiser and discovered we shared the same opinions about efficiency, coffee strength, and the particular foolishness of people who spoke at length when brevity would serve better. She took one look at my face and set down her armful of books. "Dorothy May, what happened?" We sat in the corner alcove between the reference section and the periodicals, and I told her everything. I kept my voice low and even, the way I used to deliver difficult news to patients' families. I told her about the visits, about Gerald Foss, about the documents, about the pen in my hand, about the paper left behind on my kitchen table, with $614,000 circled twice in my son's handwriting. Ruth listened without interrupting. That was one of the great gifts of her friendship. She let you finish. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "Do you know what you signed exactly?" "Not exactly. That's the problem." "Do you have copies?" "They took everything." Ruth reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out her phone. "I'm going to call Sandra." "Who's Sandra?" "My neighbor's daughter, Sandra Whitfield. She's a family attorney. She does pro bono work for seniors who've been taken advantage of. Her mother is in my Tuesday morning walking group, and I have heard enough about this woman to know she is exactly what you need right now." The phone rang twice before a clear, professional voice answered. "Sandra Whitfield." Ruth handed me the phone. I straightened my spine and spoke. I told Sandra Whitfield my story in under 4 minutes. Nursing trains you for that too, to be concise when time matters. When I finished, there was a brief silence on the other end. "Mrs. Holloway, I need to ask you something important first. When you signed these documents, were you alone with your son and these other parties? Did you have your own attorney present?" "No." "Were you given time to read the documents before signing?" "No." "Gerald Foss explained them, but quickly, and in language I couldn't follow. And you were not told you had the right to consult independent counsel before signing?" "No one mentioned it." Another brief silence. Then Sandra's voice changed. Not softer exactly, but more deliberate, the way a person sounds when they've made a decision. "Mrs. Holloway, what you're describing is a textbook case of undue influence combined with elder financial exploitation. None of this is your fault, and more importantly, none of it is necessarily permanent. But we need to move quickly. When are they planning to move you to this facility?" "Monday. The house listing goes live Tuesday. Today is Friday. That gives us 3 days. Here is exactly what I need you to do." I borrowed a pen from Ruth and wrote on the back of a library bookmark while Sandra talked. Get copies of every document from Summit Real Estate. Check the bank accounts immediately. Don't sign anything else. Don't agree to anything. And don't tell Brandon or Crystal what you're doing." "Can we actually stop this?" I asked. "We can file to stop it. Whether we succeed depends on the evidence and the judge. But Mrs. Holloway, based on what you've told me, you have a strong case. The speed of these transactions, the absence of independent counsel, the immediate financial benefit to your son, these are exactly the factors courts look for in undue influence claims." I handed Ruth her phone back. My hand, I noticed, had stopped shaking. "Well," Ruth said. "We need to go to Summit Real Estate Partners," I said, "and then to First National Bank. And I'm going to need you to come with me." Ruth picked up her purse from under the shelving cart without a moment's hesitation. "Obviously," she said. The receptionist at Summit Real Estate Partners was a cheerful woman named Denise who wore a yellow blazer and offered me a bottle of water before I'd finished explaining why I'd come. I had decided on the drive over exactly how to play this. Not the competent, clear-eyed woman I actually was. That version of me might raise questions, might prompt a call to Brandon. Instead, I played the version of me they expected. A slightly flustered older woman, a little overwhelmed by the moving process, worried she'd misplaced her paperwork. "I'm so sorry to bother you, dear," I said, letting my voice go a little vague at the edges. "I've been packing, and I think my copies of the documents went into a box somewhere, and I just want to have them for my records. You know how it is." Denise smiled the smile of someone who deals with flustered older people regularly and finds it charming. "Of course, Mrs. Holloway. Let me pull up your file." She printed everything, the complete packet of documents Gerald Foss had spread across my kitchen table 6 days ago. She handed it to me in a neat folder with the Summit Real Estate logo on the front. I thanked her warmly and left before she could think to call anyone. In Ruth's car, we read every page. The language was dense and deliberately complicated, but Sandra had told me what to look for, and once you knew what you were looking at, it was shockingly clear. A general power of attorney granting Brandon complete authority over every financial and legal decision in my life. Bank accounts, investments, real estate, medical decisions, everything. A deed transfer moving 312 Maple Drive directly into Brandon's name to facilitate the care transition. And buried in the third document in a paragraph of dense legal text that Foss had skimmed over in 30 seconds. A waiver of contest clause, in which I had apparently signed away my right to challenge any of it. Ruth's face had gone pale. "Dorothy, he can do anything. Access your savings, your pension deposits, everything." "I know," I said. "Drive me to First National." Howard Stills had been the manager of my branch for 20 years. He was a careful, decent man who had helped Robert and me refinance our mortgage in 2001 and who sent me a Christmas card every year without fail. When I walked in and asked to speak with him, his assistant showed me back immediately. Howard looked uncomfortable from the moment I sat down. Not surprised to see me. Uncomfortable, the expression of a man who has been waiting for a conversation he didn't want to have. "Mrs. Holloway," he began. "Just tell me, Howard." He looked at his desk. "Your son came in Wednesday morning. He had the power of attorney documents. Everything appeared to be in order legally, and we had no grounds to refuse." He paused. "He transferred $47,000 into a new joint account with his name as the primary holder. He left $1,500 in your checking account." The room was very quiet for a moment. "He left me $1,500, I repeated. "For immediate expenses," he said. $47,000. Every cent Robert and I had saved over decades of careful, disciplined living. The money we'd set aside instead of taking vacations. The money that was supposed to carry me through the rest of my life with dignity and independence. Gone into an account my son controlled. I sat with that for exactly as long as I could afford to, which was about 30 seconds. Then I asked Howard the only question that mattered. If I can prove the power of attorney was obtained improperly, can I get it back? With a court order, yes, but it would require legal action, and it would need to happen before Tuesday, I said. "I know." That evening, Sandra called with something that turned the floor cold beneath my feet. "Dorothy, I received the discovery documents from Brandon's attorney. I need to tell you what was on his computer." "Tell me." 3 weeks before he began pushing you toward Sunrise Valley, he was searching for villa rentals in Tuscany. 2 weeks before, vacation properties in Turks and Caicos. And Dorothy, she paused. There's a search dated 5 weeks ago. How to legally transfer elderly parent property without probate. I stood at my kitchen window, looking out at Robert's roses in the last of the evening light. This was not a son overwhelmed by worry. This was not a family making a painful decision out of love. This was a plan, researched, timed, and executed while Brandon sat across from me at Sunday dinners and told me he loved me. "Are you all right?" Sandra asked. "I'm better than all right," I said quietly. "I'm certain." They came Sunday evening for what they called a final walkthrough. I watched Brandon move through my living room with new eyes that were no longer trying to see the boy I'd raised, the man I'd loved, the son I'd wanted to believe in. I watched him the way I used to watch a difficult situation in the ER, clearly without flinching, cataloging everything. Crystal paused beside Robert's bookshelf, the one he'd built by hand from reclaimed oak, and ran one finger along the spine of his collection of American history books. Her expression was the expression of someone mentally calculating resale value. "Mom, you look rested," Brandon said, with that particular note of surprise that told me he'd been expecting me to look worse. "All packed and ready for tomorrow?" "Almost," I said pleasantly. "A few last things to sort out." He looked at me a beat too long. "You didn't go anywhere today, did you?" "Just a short walk. I like to get my steps in." Crystal glanced at Brandon. Something passed between them. A small, quick recalibration. "You should be conserving your energy, Dorothy," Crystal said, her voice honeyed. "Big day tomorrow." "You're right," I agreed. After they left, I stood at my front window and watched their taillights disappear around the corner of Maple Drive. Then I picked up my phone and called Sandra Whitfield. "I'm ready," I said. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm ready." "Good," Sandra said, "because once we file, there's no going back. He will know, and he will fight it." "Let him," I said. Tomorrow, dear listeners, I walked into a courthouse and I asked for my life back. And what happened inside that building? That's a story worth waiting for. Ruth arrived at my door at 7:15. She didn't knock loudly, just 3 quiet taps, the way she always did. The way that meant I'm here. Take your time. I was already dressed. My navy blue suit, the one I'd worn to Brandon's college graduation in 2001, the one that had been hanging in my closet for years, waiting for an occasion serious enough to deserve it. I had pressed it the night before. I had polished my good shoes. I had done my hair carefully and put on the pearl earrings Robert had given me for our 25th anniversary. If I was going to walk into a courthouse and fight for my life, I was going to look like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Ruth took one look at me and nodded. "Good," she said simply. "Let's go." Sandra Whitfield was waiting on the courthouse steps at 7:55, a compact woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of stillness that comes from absolute competence. She had a paralegal with her, a young woman named Bree who carried 3 separate folders and a large coffee that she offered to me immediately. I liked her enormously. "We're filing 3 things this morning," Sandra said as we climbed the stone steps together. First, a petition to revoke the power of attorney on grounds of undue influence and absence of independent legal counsel. Second, a temporary restraining order preventing any sale or transfer of the property. Third, an account freeze on the joint account Brandon created. Can we get all 3 today? The TRO and account freeze can be granted immediately by the duty judge if the circumstances warrant it. Given your timeline, the listing goes live tomorrow. I'm going to argue urgency. The petition to revoke goes to a full hearing, which I've requested for next Monday. We filed for 2 hours. I answered questions, signed my name to documents I actually understood this time, swore statements before a notary. The clerk who processed our paperwork was a heavy-set woman named Glenda, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and an expression of someone who had seen a great deal of the world's unkindness without becoming unkind herself. When she stamped the final document, she looked up at me over her glasses. "Mrs. Holloway, I want you to know, you are not the first woman to stand at this counter with this exact situation. I hope you won't be the last, but I'm glad you came." I thanked her and meant it. By 10:15, it was done. The temporary restraining order was granted. The account was frozen. Brandon Holloway could not sell my house, could not access my money, could not move a single piece of my life without a judge's permission. I stood on the courthouse steps in the October sunlight and felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not victory, not yet, but solid ground beneath my feet. I arrived home at 11:20 to find Brandon's car already in my driveway. He was standing on my front porch, and even from the end of the driveway I could see the set of his shoulders. Tight, controlled, the posture of a man keeping a very short leash on something that wanted to break loose. Crystal stood beside him with her arms crossed, her face arranged into something that was trying to be composed and not quite managing it. I walked up the front path at my normal pace. I did not hurry. I did not slow down. "Where have you been?" Brandon's voice was carefully level. "We had an appointment at Sunrise Valley. They were expecting you at 10 o'clock. "I had something to take care of," I said. "Something to—" He stopped. His eyes narrowed. "Mom, why did Paul Garrett from Summit Real Estate just call me to say there's a court order blocking the sale of this house?" Crystal held up her phone. "He called Brandon the moment it came through. Something about undue influence. A restraining order." Her voice had an edge to it now, thin and sharp. "What exactly did you do, Dorothy?" I looked at my son, my only child, the boy I had fed and clothed and driven to baseball practice, and sat up with through fevers and heartbreaks and the ordinary disasters of growing up. I looked at the man he had become, standing on my porch like he owned it, which he had been very close to doing. "I protected what is mine," I said. Brandon's face went through several expressions very quickly. Shock, then something hot and urgent, then the practiced smoothness of a man who negotiates for a living. "Mom, listen to me very carefully. You are going to call your attorney right now and tell her this was all a misunderstanding. You were confused. You were overwhelmed. We will chalk this up to stress and move forward, and we will not speak of it again." "I wasn't confused," I said. "I was deceived. There's a difference. You are 74 years old. I'm aware of how old I am, Brandon. I'm also aware that you moved $47,000 out of my account without asking me, that you transferred my house into your name, that you searched for vacation properties in Tuscany and Turks and Caicos before you ever mentioned Sunrise Valley to me." The color left his face. "And I am aware," I continued, "that Gerald Foss is not an independent consultant. He works for Summit Real Estate. He stood in my living room and pretended to be on my side while he was on yours." "Mom, don't." The word came out quiet and final, like a door closing. "Don't tell me you did this out of love. Don't tell me this was about my safety. I read the numbers, Brandon. I saw what you circled." He grabbed my arm. Not violently, but firmly, the grip of someone used to getting what they want through pressure rather than force. "Let go of my arm," I said, "or I will call the police." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It felt much longer. Brandon's hand dropped. "You would call the police on your own son." "If my own son is threatening me—" "Yes," without hesitation. He stared at me, and I saw it happen. The moment he truly looked at me, perhaps for the first time in months. Not a resource, not a problem to be managed, not an old woman who could be hustled into signing papers at her own kitchen table. Just me, Dorothy May Holloway, still standing. "Fine," he said, his voice going cold and flat. "Fine. You want to do this the hard way? Do it the hard way. Don't call me when you fall down those stairs. Don't call me when you can't manage anymore. You made your choice." He walked to his car. Crystal followed, pausing at the bottom of the steps to look back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Fury, yes, but something else underneath it. Something that might have been, in another life, almost like respect. The car backed out hard and fast. I heard the tires on the pavement long after the car was out of sight. I stood on my porch alone. Then I went inside, sat at my kitchen table, and called Ruth. "It's done," I said. "Get the others. I think I need my friends tonight." By 7 o'clock that evening, Ruth's living room held 4 women and enough coffee and conviction to fill a courtroom twice over. Patricia Drummond had driven 40 minutes from her place on the east side of town without being asked twice. She was 78, broad-shouldered, with white hair she wore in a long braid and a history of her own. 3 years ago, her daughter had tried to force her out of her lake house through a quietly arranged conservatorship that Patricia had fought and won. She arrived with a folder of her own legal documents and the expression of a general who recognizes a familiar battlefield. She sat beside me and put her hand over mine. "You are doing the right thing," she said. "My daughter didn't speak to me for 2 years after I fought her, and I would do it again tomorrow. My house is mine. My life is mine. That's what matters." Nancy Everett worked part-time at a local attorney's office and arrived with a yellow legal pad and a pen, already taking notes before she'd taken off her coat. She walked me through what to expect at the hearing. The questions a judge typically asked, the kind of testimony that carried weight, the tactics opposing counsel might use. "They'll likely argue cognitive decline," she said matter-of-factly. "It's the standard play in these cases. They can't easily argue the documents weren't signed, so they'll argue you weren't competent to understand what you were signing." "I'm perfectly competent," I said. "I know that, and you know that. On Monday, you'll need the judge to know it too. Sandra will prepare you." Ruth kept the coffee coming and periodically offered commentary on Brandon and Crystal that was so precisely and creatively uncharitable that it cut through the fear and made us all laugh, which I think was entirely the point. Sandra called at 9 to confirm our preparation session for Sunday afternoon and to tell me something that made my stomach drop. "Dorothy, I've heard from their attorney, a man named Douglas Wyatt. He's good, expensive, and they're planning to argue that you're mentally incompetent to manage your own affairs." I had been expecting it after what Nancy said. It still landed hard. "Are you ready to fight that?" Sandra asked. I looked around Ruth's living room. Patricia with her folder of hard-won legal victories. Nancy with her yellow legal pad. Ruth refilling coffee cups with the calm efficiency of a woman who handles problems by being more prepared than the problem. "I've been ready my whole life," I said. "I just didn't know it yet." Friday afternoon, the doorbell at Ruth's house rang. Through the window, I saw Brandon standing alone on the porch. No Crystal. He was holding flowers, pink roses, my favorite, the exact shade of Robert's roses in June. His face was arranged in an expression I recognized from his childhood, the contrite, slightly boyish look he'd worn at 8 years old when he'd broken the kitchen window, playing baseball, and needed to confess. I opened the door but did not invite him in. "Mom." His voice was careful, genuine-seeming. "Please, just 5 minutes." Ruth materialized at my shoulder like she'd been waiting. "Right here is fine," I said. He accepted the terms. Standing on the porch, he told me he'd been thinking, that he'd been wrong, that Crystal had pushed him to move faster than he should have. His voice cracked in 2 or 3 of the right places. He held the roses toward me like an offering. "If you drop the case," he said, "I will transfer every penny back to your account Monday morning. I'll sign a document keeping the house in your name. We can start over, Mom. No courts, no lawyers, no ugliness." I looked at the roses. Then I looked at my son. "Did you book the villa in Tuscany yet?" I asked quietly. Something moved across his face. Just a flicker, half a second. But I had spent 30 years reading people in crisis, and I caught it cleanly. "I don't know what you're—" "Who sent you, Brandon?" I said. "Was it Douglas Wyatt's idea? Or Crystal's?" The warmth drained out of his face the way heat leaves a room when a window opens. "Mom, I'm trying to help you avoid what is going to be a very expensive, very public, very embarrassing legal battle. My attorney has resources you can't match. I have connections in this town. I can make this drag on for a year, 2 years. Your savings will be gone in legal fees before we ever see a verdict." "Sandra is working pro bono," I said. He hadn't expected that. I watched him recalculate. Even so, then Crystal stepped out from behind the oak tree at the corner of Ruth's front yard. She had not stayed in the car. She had been standing there the whole time, listening, waiting to see if Brandon's performance would be enough. It wasn't. "You want to know the truth, Dorothy?" Her voice was stripped of everything soft now. No honeyed concern, no careful warmth, nothing but the cold thing underneath. "Tomorrow in that courtroom, we are going to prove you are incompetent. We have a psychiatrist prepared to testify. We have neighbors who will say you've been confused, forgetful, erratic. And when the judge rules in our favor, and he will, you are going to Sunrise Valley. That house is going to be sold, and there will not be one single thing you can do about it." Ruth stepped forward. "You just threatened my friend on my front porch, in front of a witness." "Stay out of this. Write down everything she just said," I told Ruth, my voice perfectly steady. "Every word." Crystal grabbed Brandon's arm. They left. The pink roses sat on Ruth's porch steps where Brandon had set them, and neither of us picked them up. I went inside and called Sandra. "They showed me exactly who they are," I said. "Siad." Crystal threatened me in front of Ruth, all of it, the psychiatrist, the neighbors, the whole plan. "Good," Sandra said, and I heard something like quiet satisfaction in her voice. Ruth will be a witness, and Dorothy? That outburst is going to matter on Monday. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, and colder. Wood-paneled walls, fluorescent lighting that flattened everything to the same pale severity, the smell of old paper and institutional carpet. I sat at the petitioner's table in my navy suit and kept my hands flat on the surface in front of me to stop them from shaking. Brandon and Crystal sat at the respondent's table with Douglas Wyatt between them. Wyatt was polished and unhurried in the way of a man who charged $400 an hour and felt the rate was reasonable. Judge Patricia Odom entered at 9 sharp. She was in her late 50s with reading glasses she wore low on her nose and the expression of someone who had spent decades in family court watching human beings at their worst and had developed, in response, an absolute intolerance for theater. She reviewed her papers for a full minute before she spoke. This is the petition of Dorothy May Holloway to revoke power of attorney and reverse property transfers. Miss Whitfield, you're representing the petitioner. Mr. Wyatt, you're representing the respondent. Let's proceed without wasting each other's time. Wyatt opened smoothly. His client was a devoted son, deeply concerned about an aging mother showing troubling signs of decline. The arrangements had been made lovingly, carefully, entirely in her best interests. He called Crystal first. She was composed on the stand, demure, quietly sorrowful. Under Wyatt's gentle questioning, she painted a picture of a woman who forgot meals, left the stove burning, struggled to remember names, needed more help than she would admit. Sandra stood for cross-examination. Mrs. Holloway, you testified that Dorothy forgot names. Can you give me a specific example? Crystal hesitated. She sometimes forgot the names of people we mentioned. People you mentioned, not people she knew personally. Well, the stove left burning. When did you personally witness this? Brandon told me, so you didn't see it yourself. No, but has Dorothy's electricity ever been disconnected for non-payment? Not that I know of. Her property taxes, paid on time for the past 5 years? Silence. I have the records here, Your Honor. Paid in full, on time, every year. Sandra set the documents on the judge's bench with the quiet confidence of someone laying down a winning hand. One more question. When Dorothy signed the power of attorney, did she have her own attorney present to explain the documents? Gerald Foss explained everything. Gerald Foss, who is a contract employee of Summit Real Estate Partners, the firm that stood to earn $41,000 in commission from the sale of Dorothy's home. That Gerald Foss? Objection, Wyatt said. Relevance? Sustained, Judge Odom said, but she was looking at Crystal with new attention. Brandon took the stand. He was better than Crystal, steadier, more practiced. He spoke about his father's last words, about a promise to keep his mother safe. Sandra waited. Mr. Holloway, you expressed concern about your mother's well-being. In the 6 months before arranging her move to Sunrise Valley, how many medical appointments did you schedule for her? Pause. We were in the process of, how many? None yet, but you were deeply concerned about her health, but never once took her to a doctor. Sandra opened a folder. Your Honor, these documents were obtained through legal discovery. They show Mr. Holloway's computer search history from the 5 weeks preceding his mother's signing of these documents. She read aloud. Tuscany Villa Rental, Turks and Caicos Vacation Property, and she looked up. How to legally transfer elderly parent property without probate. Twist 4. Gerald Foss. Furthermore, Your Honor, the man introduced to Dorothy Holloway as an independent elder care consultant, Gerald Foss, is a contracted employee of Summit Real Estate Partners, as shown in this employment agreement obtained through discovery. There was no independent advice given to Mrs. Holloway at any point during this process. Every person in that room on the day she signed had a financial interest in her signing. Wyatt objected. Judge Odom overruled him and read the document herself. I took the stand last. I told my story the way I had told stories my whole professional life, to doctors, to families, to people who needed the truth clearly and without decoration. I told them about the kitchen table and the pen pressed into my hand, about the paper left behind with $614,000 circled in my son's handwriting, about Howard Still's uncomfortable face when he told me $47,000 was gone. Wyatt tried to rattle me. Mrs. Holloway, isn't it true that you sometimes forget things? I forget the names of actors in movies, I said. I have never forgotten who owns my house. Judge Odom set down her pen. She looked at both tables for a long moment, the look of a woman assembling a verdict she had effectively already reached. It is the finding of this court that Dorothy May Holloway is of sound mind and fully capable of managing her own affairs. The power of attorney is hereby revoked. The deed transfer is void and of no legal effect. Mr. Holloway, you will return all funds removed from your mother's accounts within 48 hours, or this court will refer the matter for criminal prosecution under elder financial abuse statutes. She looked at Brandon directly. Furthermore, I am issuing a permanent restraining order preventing Brandon Holloway and Crystal Holloway from coming within 500 feet of Dorothy Holloway or her property without her explicit written consent. Brandon stood. She is my mother. She is also an autonomous adult whose rights you violated in a calculated and deliberate manner. Judge Odom's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. We are finished here. 48 hours after the hearing, every dollar was back in my account. My account alone, no joint access, no Brandon Holloway anywhere on the paperwork. The deed to 312 Maple Drive was re-recorded in my name. The power of attorney documents were officially destroyed. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived from Sunrise Valley Retirement Community. Formal letterhead, apologetic tone. Due to the late cancellation of the reservation, the $15,000 deposit would be forfeited in full per the terms of the agreement. The $15,000 Brandon had paid from his own account, not mine. I sat in my kitchen and read that letter twice. Then I set it down, looked out at Robert's roses, and laughed. A real laugh, full and unself-conscious, the kind I hadn't heard from myself in months. You see that, Robert? I said to the garden. Justice has a sense of humor after all. Sandra called to tell me I had grounds for criminal charges. I thought about it for less time than people might expect. Do it, I said. The district attorney's office took the case without hesitation. 3 months later, Brandon accepted a plea. 5 years probation, 200 hours of community service, full restitution of legal fees, and a permanent record of elder financial abuse. He would never hold a financial services license again. Crystal filed for divorce during the criminal proceedings. Our small town, as small towns do, talked. Brandon became unemployable in any professional capacity. Crystal moved into a studio apartment across town. The country club they'd been trying to join sent a polite letter of rejection. I heard these things through the ordinary channels of community life and felt each time precisely nothing. Not satisfaction, not grief, not the complicated ache of a mother mourning the son she'd raised. Just nothing. The woman who had loved him without reservation, who had pressed his graduation suit and saved for his college tuition, and sat up with him through every ordinary heartbreak of his early life. That woman had walked into a courthouse on a Monday morning and had not entirely walked back out. What came out instead was something clearer, something that had always been there beneath the love, waiting for the moment love was no longer enough protection. Brandon sent a letter during his probation, 3 pages of careful language that circled the truth without landing on it, that explained without apologizing, that justified what could not be justified. I read it once, sitting at my kitchen table with cold tea, and then I carried it to the fireplace and set it alight. I did not need his version of events. I had my own. 1 year after the hearing, I stood in my garden on a Saturday morning in June with a cup of coffee and watched Robert's roses do what they had always done. Bloom, stubbornly, beautifully, without being asked. My life had not returned to what it was before. It had become something better, something I hadn't known to want because I'd been too busy holding the old life together to imagine a new one. I had joined the fitness class at the community center. Tuesday and Thursday mornings, an hour of movement with women who had become genuine friends, women who understood, as I now understood in my bones, that the body at 74 is not a body in decline, but a body that has survived everything thrown at it and is still, remarkably, here. Thomas Greer, the library's head librarian, had begun joining me for dinner on occasional Friday evenings. He was 75, a widower, and he talked about books the way Robert had talked about baseball, with complete and unself-conscious enthusiasm. The evenings were easy and warm and entirely uncomplicated, which felt, at this stage of my life, like its own kind of luxury. I had expanded my volunteer hours to 3 days a week. I had taken 2 trips, the Oregon coast with Ruth, San Francisco with Patricia, and had 2 more planned for fall. I had added raised garden beds and was growing more tomatoes than I could eat, which meant the food bank received a weekly delivery and my bridge club received tomato sauce at every meeting. Sandra called on the anniversary of the hearing. "Your case has become something of a landmark in elder law in this state," she said. "I've had 4 new clients contact me after reading about it." You gave them courage, Dorothy. I sat with that for a moment. The idea that something so private, so painful, could have traveled that far and done that much good. Ruth came over that evening, and we sat on my porch with wine as the sun went down over Maple Drive, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose that made the whole street look like something from a painting. "Do you ever regret it?" Ruth asked. "Fighting instead of just letting it go?" I thought about it honestly, the way Ruth deserved. "No," I said. "Not for 1 minute. Even if I had lost the house, the money, all of it, I would not regret it, because I would have lost it fighting, on my feet, as myself." Ruth was quiet. "You saved yourself," she said finally. "I did," I agreed. The roses were still blooming. The third porch step still creaked. The kitchen table was still the center of everything, still the place where the important things happened. Only now the important things were bridge club and coffee with friends, and the particular peace of a woman who knows exactly where she belongs. I was 74 years old. I was home. I was free. And I had learned, later than I should have, but not too late, the most important thing there is to know. You are never too old to stand up for yourself. And the moment you decide to, everything changes. So that is my story, dear listeners. What did I learn from all of it? That age is not the same as helplessness. That love is not the same as loyalty. That the people who truly belong in your life will stand beside you when it costs them something. And the ones who don't will show you who they are the moment you stop being useful to them. If someone is taking your power, your money, your choices, your dignity, fight back. Get help. Find your Ruth, your Sandra, your Patricia, your Nancy. They are out there, and you are stronger than you have been allowed to believe. I was 74 when my son tried to erase me. I am 75 now, and I have never, in all my life, felt more alive. Thank you for listening, and if this story found you at a moment when you needed it, I hope it helps you remember you are not done yet, not even close.